Early on a Saturday morning, I stepped out of my house, fully aware that this day would change my life. I had the same certainty I'd had 3 years ago, standing in my kitchen, phone in hand, staring at a text message that ended my marriage. "I'm sorry, Rachel. This isn't working." That was all it said. No explanation. No attempt at a conversation. Just a single, detached sentence that shattered 15 years of my life. I remember the feeling in my chest, like something inside me had been ripped out so fast that my body hadn't even registered the pain yet. I remember the cup of coffee slipping from my fingers, shattering against the tiled floor. And I remember, most of all, the moment I understood exactly what was happening. I had suspected for months. The late nights at the office. The way Eric had started dressing differently, new suits, tailored just a little too well. A sudden interest in cologne when, for years, he hadn't cared about anything beyond aftershave. He had always been a confident man, but lately, it was different. He carried himself like someone who had a secret. That morning, I learned what that secret was. He had replaced me with Nicole. Nicole was 28. Blonde, impossibly polished, always smiling just a little too wide. She had started working as Eric's secretary a year before he left me, and I had noticed her immediately. Not because she was stunning, though she was, but because she had that rare, calculated charm that women like me recognize instantly. She was the kind of woman who never showed her cards too soon, who let men feel like they were the ones making the moves. She laughed at their jokes, even when they weren't funny. She made them feel interesting, powerful, needed. And Eric? Eric had always loved to be admired. I wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. Never had been. I was blunt, sometimes too blunt. I never softened my words to soothe his ego, never pretended to agree when I didn't. I had spent our marriage pushing him to be better, to think smarter, to take risks that actually mattered instead of chasing every shiny new venture that crossed his path. Apparently, that wasn't what he wanted. What he wanted was someone like Nicole, someone who nodded in all the right places, who never challenged him, who let him believe he was the smartest person in the room. I could have handled the divorce if he had at least had the decency to be honest. If he had sat me down and told me the truth. But Eric didn't do that. Instead, he rewrote our history. He told our friends, our business partners, the people we had known for over a decade, that I was holding him back. That I was too difficult. That he had been the one trying to save our marriage, but I had made it impossible. I remember the first time I heard the rumors. It was at a charity event, 6 months after the divorce. I had forced myself to go, determined not to let him make me disappear from the circles we had built together. I had barely stepped inside when I heard them whispering. She must be devastated. I mean, Nicole is gorgeous. I heard she was impossible to live with. Controlling, you know? Eric must be so much happier now. She's lucky she even got a settlement. He built that company from the ground up. I felt sick. He built that company? I had been there before Barnes Tech was even an idea. I had helped him with his pitches, connected him with investors, sat with him in our tiny apartment at 2 in the morning while he agonized over his first product launch. I had sacrificed years of my life for that company. But in their eyes, I had been the wife. And Eric? He had made sure that's all they saw. Over time, the humiliation faded, but the rage remained. The whispers turned into news articles about his meteoric rise in the tech world, about how Barnes Tech was one of the fastest-growing companies in Miami, about his brilliant leadership. And every time, Nicole was there, at his side, smiling for the cameras like she had earned her place there. I had disappeared from the narrative completely. For 3 years, I let them talk. Let them believe I had been discarded, that I had faded into irrelevance, that without Eric, I was nothing. And for 3 years, I planned. Because what they didn't know, what he didn't know, was that I hadn't spent those years wallowing. I hadn't disappeared. I had been waiting. And now my moment had arrived. I looked up at the towering glass skyscraper in front of me. Palm Bay Tower. One of the most prestigious office buildings in Miami. 3 years ago, I had been nothing more than a wife in the background, someone Eric had outgrown. Now, I was the owner of the building his company called home. Today, Eric Barnes was going to learn exactly how wrong he had been. The divorce didn't break me. It should have. I had spent 15 years of my life building a marriage, only to have it tossed aside like an outdated business model. I had supported Eric through every stage of his career, only to become an inconvenience when he decided I no longer fit his image. For months after the divorce, I felt hollow. I had given up my own ambitions to help Eric build Barnes Tech, and in the end, I had nothing to show for it except a settlement check that felt more like hush money than justice. I could have taken the easy route. I could have taken my money, moved somewhere new, and started over quietly. But I had never been the type to back down from a fight. And this was war. The first thing I did was learn. Not just casual reading, not just surface-level knowledge. I immersed myself in commercial real estate, finance, investment strategies. I spent sleepless nights absorbing textbooks, online courses, case studies. I attended conferences where men in tailored suits dismissed me, assuming I was just another socialite looking for a hobby. I let them underestimate me, let them smile politely as they explained things I already knew in excruciating detail. I let them assume I was harmless, because I understood something they didn't. Power isn't about knowing more. It's about knowing when to strike. The first year was the hardest. No one took me seriously. Doors closed in my face before I even had the chance to explain why they should open. But I kept pushing. I built a network, not the cocktail party kind, but real, strategic connections. People who mattered. People who knew things. And then, the opportunity came. An older real estate mogul, one of the city's biggest commercial property owners, was quietly looking to sell one of his buildings. Palm Bay Tower. It was an iconic office building in downtown Miami, home to some of the most influential companies in the city. It wasn't on the market yet. He wanted a discreet deal, no public bidding, no drawn-out negotiations. I saw my opening and I took it. I leveraged every connection I had, pulled every string, gathered every cent I had saved, and even mortgaged some of my assets to make it happen. It was risky. It was reckless. But I pulled it off. Palm Bay Tower was mine, and inside it, Barnes Tech's headquarters. The irony was delicious. For years, Eric had built his empire in that office. He had held meetings, signed million-dollar deals, made grand speeches about innovation, all under a roof he thought he controlled. But the ground beneath his feet had shifted. I didn't just want the building. I wanted him trapped in it. And now he was. His company's lease was set to expire in 6 months, and as the new owner, I had the power to decide what happened next. I could have evicted him immediately, could have given him 30 days' notice and watched him scramble to find a new space. But that would have been too easy. No, I wanted him to feel it first. I wanted him to sit in his sleek glass office, completely unaware that the walls around him were closing in. So I waited. I let him continue his work, let him believe he was untouchable. And then, when the time was right, I made my move. I sent a formal notice to Barnes Tech. Lease renewal negotiations were required. Not through his assistant. Not through a faceless legal team. No. I insisted on a personal meeting. Because I knew Eric. I knew that he loved handling high-stakes deals himself. He always saw them as an opportunity to showcase his power, to prove that he was the smartest person in the room. This time, he was walking straight into my trap. And he didn't even know it yet. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. on a Friday. Eric had no idea what was coming. He probably thought it was just another negotiation, another chance to flex his power. I could already picture it, him walking into the conference room in his custom-tailored suit, flashing that easy, confident smile he reserved for business deals. The same smile he had once used on me, back when I was the woman standing beside him instead of the one standing in his way. But today, he wasn't walking into just any deal. He was walking into mine. I arrived at Palm Bay Tower early, taking the elevator up to the 45th floor, Barnes Tech's headquarters. It had been a long time since I had stepped into one of Eric's offices. The last time I had been in a space like this, I was still his wife. I was still the woman he called late at night to bounce ideas off of, the one who stood beside him at networking events, the one who helped him rehearse his speeches before big investor meetings. Now, I was the reason this meeting existed in the first place. I stepped into the conference room, taking my seat at the far end of the long, polished table. The city skyline stretched out behind me, a view I had paid an unimaginable amount of money for. It had been worth every cent. At exactly 10 a.m., the glass doors opened, and Eric Barnes walked in. For the first few seconds, he didn't recognize me. His attention was on the documents in his hands, his mind already working through whatever terms he expected to negotiate. Then, his eyes lifted, and he froze. I watched it happen in real time, the slight hitch in his step, the flicker of confusion, the moment his brain caught up with what he was seeing. His ex-wife, sitting at the head of the table in his conference room. Except it wasn't his anymore. A slow, creeping realization dawned across his face as his gaze dropped to the nameplate in front of me. Rachel Barnes, owner, Palm Bay Tower. For the first time in years, Eric was speechless. I smiled. "Eric," I said smoothly, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Please, have a seat." He didn't move at first. His eyes flicked from my face to the documents in his hands, as if searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Finally, as if on autopilot, he pulled out the chair and sat down. His voice was controlled when he spoke, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "What is this?" I leaned back in my chair, crossing one leg over the other. "This," I said, "is a lease renewal negotiation." I watched as he processed my words, as the truth of the situation settled over him like a weight he hadn't been prepared to carry. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. How? When? Why? But I didn't give him the satisfaction of an answer. Instead, I slid a folder across the table. "The lease for Barnes Tech's headquarters is up in 3 months," I said. "As the new owner of Palm Bay Tower, I have some changes I'd like to propose." Eric hesitated before picking up the folder. His fingers were steady as he flipped it open, but I didn't miss the way his jaw tightened when he saw the numbers inside. Because, I had made some changes. Significant ones. Under my terms, Barnes Tech's new lease would include a 35% increase in rent, additional operating fees for maintenance and building security, a clause requiring approval for any executive office renovations, including his, and my personal favorite, an early termination penalty so steep that relocating the company would cost him more than staying. I watched him read through each clause, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something dangerously close to anger. "You can't be serious," he finally said. I tilted my head. "I've never been more serious in my life." He let out a short laugh, sharp, incredulous. "This is ridiculous. There's no way we're agreeing to this." I shrugged. "That's your choice. You can refuse the terms, of course." Eric's eyes narrowed. "And what? Move an entire tech company to a new headquarters in 3 months? Do you have any idea how?" He stopped. Because he knew I knew. I knew exactly how expensive, disruptive, and damaging it would be for Barnes Tech to move. I also knew that Eric had spent the last year heavily investing in expansions and product launches. His company was growing, which meant his cash flow was stretched thin. I had studied his financials. I had planned for this exact moment. He didn't have the money to move. Not without losing millions. And he knew it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You've had a good run, Eric," I said. "But the way I see it, you have 2 options." I held up a finger. 1, you accept the new terms and continue operating out of Palm Bay Tower under my conditions. Then I held up a second finger. Or 2, you scramble to find a new headquarters, hemorrhage money in the process, and set your company back at least a year in expansion plans. I gave him a sympathetic smile. Either way, I win. His hand clenched into a fist on the table. "You're doing this to get back at me." I let the accusation hang in the air for a moment before I answered. "No, Eric." I shook my head. "This isn't about getting back at you." Then I smiled. "This is about showing you that you were wrong." I stood up, smoothing out the front of my blazer. "Take your time reviewing the terms," I said. "I'll expect your decision by the end of next week." Eric didn't move. Didn't argue. Didn't even speak. He just sat there, staring at the document that told him, in no uncertain terms, that the woman he had discarded had just outplayed him. I walked to the door, pausing just before I left. "Oh, and one more thing." He looked up. I met his gaze, letting my next words sink in. "I was never holding you back." Then I walked out, leaving him sitting in the ruins of his own arrogance. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt truly, undeniably free. Eric didn't respond right away. I expected that. He needed time to process, to scramble, to convince himself this wasn't happening. For the next few days, I imagined how it must have gone behind closed doors. The moment he stormed back into his office, slamming the folder onto his desk. The way he probably called his lawyers first, demanding they find a loophole in the contract. Then his CFO, barking orders to run the numbers again, to figure out any way to escape the noose I had so carefully tied around his company's neck. But there was no way out. Every clause, every percentage increase, every early termination fee, I had planned it too well. Eric had backed himself into a corner, and the only way out was through me. For days later, he asked for another meeting. This time, it wasn't just him. He brought his entire executive team, his CFO, his legal counsel, and his operations director. They walked into my office like a small army, ready for battle. I was waiting. I had spent years watching these men at gala dinners and corporate parties, listening as they casually dismissed women like me as CEO wives instead of the actual architects behind their success. Now, I was the one sitting at the head of the table. Eric took his seat across from me, looking composed, but I knew him too well. The tightness in his jaw, the slight twitch in his fingers. He was furious. And underneath that, he was afraid. His legal counsel, a stiff-looking man named Carter, was the first to speak. "These new lease terms are outrageous, Ms. Barnes." I smiled, as if the insult hadn't just rolled off his tongue. "I don't believe so, Mr. Carter. In fact, I believe the adjustments are perfectly reasonable, given market conditions." Eric let out a short, humorless laugh. "Market conditions? You and I both know this isn't about that." I tilted my head. "Oh, what do you think it's about?" He leaned forward, his voice lower. "You're trying to ruin me." For a split second, I considered telling him the truth. That this wasn't about ruining him. This was about correcting him. Correcting the version of our story he had been feeding to the world for years. Correcting the arrogant belief that I had been nothing more than a footnote in his success. Instead, I simply gave him a cool, practiced smile. "I think you overestimate your importance." His CFO cleared his throat, clearly eager to shift the conversation. "Look, Ms. Barnes," he said, forcing a polite tone. "There must be some flexibility in these terms. Surely, we can negotiate something more reasonable." I let the silence stretch between us before I responded. "The terms are reasonable," I said simply. "And they're final." A muscle jumped in Eric's jaw. "You really want to play this game?" he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Eric." I leaned forward, lowering my voice just enough to make sure the impact of my next words hit their mark. "This isn't a game." For the first time since he had walked in, something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt. Uncertainty. I watched it sink in, the understanding that I hadn't done this just to annoy him. I had done this because I was better at the game than he was. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're going to regret this," he muttered. I smiled. "No, Eric," I said softly. "I'm really not." 2 weeks passed. And just as I expected, cracks began to form. Eric tried to push back. He tried to stall. He sent his legal team after me, hoping to mid-date me into renegotiating. It didn't work. I had the best real estate attorneys on my side, ones who had spent weeks dissecting every single line of that lease before I ever handed it to him. His legal threats fell flat. Then he tried to go public. A carefully placed article in the Miami Business Journal, framing me as the vindictive ex-wife trying to punish him by inflating his lease. I had prepared for that too. Within 24 hours, a counterpiece went live in Forbes, highlighting the real story. A sharp, scathing article about how Palm Bay Tower's new owner, a highly underestimated businesswoman, had strategically acquired one of Miami's most valuable properties and was now running one of the most competitive commercial real estate portfolios in the state. Eric's attempt to make me look petty had backfired spectacularly. Instead of seeing me as a bitter ex, the business world was impressed. They weren't whispering about how Eric had traded me in for Nicole anymore. Now, they were whispering about how he had underestimated me. I could only imagine how much that burned. Then, something happened that I hadn't planned for. Nicole left him. It was almost poetic. One day, she was the ever-present fixture on his arm, attending galas, smiling for cameras, playing the perfect role. The next, she was gone. And she didn't leave quietly. One morning, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. No subject line. No introduction. Just a single PDF attachment. I clicked it open. And there, in neat columns, was a financial spreadsheet. Barnes-Tech expense reports. And they were riddled with fraud, unauthorized deductions, inflated earnings, questionable stock movements. A very specific pattern, one that, when pieced together, showed a clear attempt to manipulate company finances. At the top of the email, a single sentence had been typed. I thought you should see this. No name, but I didn't need one. Nicole. She had bailed, and she had burned the bridge on her way out. I let out a slow breath, staring at the numbers on my screen. Eric had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated Nicole just like he had underestimated me. And now, she had handed me the perfect P*N to finish what I had started. 2 weeks later, Eric Barnes was removed as CEO of Barnes-Tech. The board had no choice. Once the financial discrepancies had been exposed, his entire leadership was called into question. The company's stock plummeted. Investors panicked. And the board did what they always do when they need a scapegoat. They sacrificed the king. Eric was ousted. Not just fired. Publicly disgraced. The man who had once laughed about how I would never amount to anything without him was now the pariah of Miami's tech industry. His fall from grace was brutal. And I just kept rising. Palm Bay Tower became one of the most sought-after commercial spaces in Miami. My name became synonymous with power. And for the first time in my life, I owned my success. Eric had spent years making sure everyone knew I was just his ex-wife. Now, I was the woman who outplayed him. And that was the only legacy that mattered. Eric Barnes disappeared from the public eye after his downfall. It happened quickly. One moment, he was the golden boy of Miami's tech industry, and the next, he was a cautionary tale. The financial fraud had shattered his credibility. Investors abandoned him, stockholders turned on him, and his name, once synonymous with success, became a stain no one wanted near their portfolio. Barnes-Tech was sold off in pieces, its assets absorbed by companies that had once been his rivals. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of the industry was now a pariah. And I was just getting started. Palm Bay Tower wasn't just an investment, it became my empire. I rebranded it, pouring millions into renovations and modernizations. New security systems, upgraded office spaces, cutting-edge conference rooms. I brought in high-profile tenants, companies that had been eager for prime real estate, but unwilling to deal with the instability of Barnes-Tech's reputation. It worked. Within a year, Palm Bay Tower wasn't just a landmark, it was the most coveted commercial property in downtown Miami. People no longer talked about Eric Barnes when they mentioned the building. They talked about me. For years, I had been nothing more than Eric's ex-wife in business circles. But now, I was a powerhouse in my own right. I was invited to investment summits, asked to speak at real estate conferences. Business magazines ran features on me, on how I had transformed my divorce into a multi-million-dollar success story. People admired me, respected me. Some even feared me. And I made sure Eric felt it. Not through direct revenge, I had already dismantled his career. But through something far more satisfying, irrelevance. I had taken everything he once thought was his and made it better without him. Success wasn't enough for me. I wanted more. Not just for myself, but for women like me, the ones who had been overlooked, underestimated, pushed to the side while their husbands, boyfriends, or male colleagues took all the credit. So I started a mentorship program for women in business. I partnered with investment firms and real estate developers, offering workshops, funding opportunities, and networking events designed to help women break into industries that had been gatekept by men like Eric. The program exploded in popularity. In its first year alone, we helped over 100 women secure funding for their startups, land executive positions, and negotiate better business deals. Miami's business world took notice. Because I wasn't just winning. I was changing the game. I hadn't seen Eric in over a year. Not since the last time he sat across from me in that conference room, realizing he had lost. But then, one afternoon, I spotted him. I was leaving Palm Bay Tower, my driver waiting for me at the curb, when I saw him across the street. He looked different. The confident, arrogant man I had once loved was gone. In his place was someone smaller. Someone who had once commanded rooms but now tried to disappear into them. His expensive suits had been replaced with something cheaper, something off the rack. His hair, always perfectly styled, was slightly unkempt. And most telling of all, he was alone. No entourage. No young, beautiful girlfriend on his arm. No cameras waiting to catch his next move. He was nothing now. Just another forgotten businessman, struggling to stay afloat in an industry that had already moved on without him. A few days later, my assistant called me as I was heading into a board meeting. "Rachel," she said hesitantly, "Eric Barnes left something for you at the front desk." I paused. Eric hadn't reached out to me in over a year. I had no reason to believe he ever would again. Curious, I told her to bring it up to my office. When I returned an hour later, an envelope sat on my desk. I opened it. Inside was something I hadn't expected. His old executive nameplate. Eric Barnes, founder and CEO, Barnes Tech. It was scratched, slightly dented, likely the one that had once sat on his massive oak desk back when he ruled his company like a king. But there was something else. A single, handwritten note. "You were right." That was it. No apology. No explanations. No attempt to rebuild a bridge that had long since burned. Just 3 words. I sat back in my chair, staring at the note, feeling nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. No lingering bitterness. Just peace. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need anything from him. Because I had won. Not by taking him down, but by proving, beyond any doubt, that he had never been the one who made me powerful. I had done that all on my own. I slipped the nameplate back into the envelope and tucked it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Not as a reminder of him, but as a reminder of how far I had come. 1 year after Eric Barnes' downfall, I stood on stage at one of the biggest business forums in Miami. The room was packed: executives, investors, entrepreneurs, all gathered to hear from industry leaders. And this time, I was one of them. The stage lights were bright, but I was unfazed. I had given enough speeches in the past year to know exactly how to hold a room's attention. I adjusted the microphone and let my gaze sweep across the audience. "Success," I began, "isn't about how loudly you talk in a room." A few people chuckled, already intrigued. "It's about how well you listen, how well you adapt, and most importantly, how well you rise after you've been underestimated." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. For years, I was seen as a background character in my own life. People assumed I was just someone's wife, just an accessory to someone else's success. I could see heads nodding. Some of the women in the audience were leaning forward now, their expressions shifting from polite interest to something more personal. But what they didn't realize, I continued, was that I was never just an accessory. I was the foundation, the strategist, the silent force behind the scenes. I smiled slightly. And when I was discarded, when I was told I would never amount to anything on my own, I spread my hands. Well, you all know how that turned out. The audience erupted into applause. I let the moment breathe before delivering my final words. "The next time someone underestimates you," I said, looking directly at the women in the audience, let them believe you're harmless. Let them believe they've won." I leaned in slightly. "And then, when the time is right, prove them wrong." The applause was deafening. As I stepped off stage, shaking hands and exchanging smiles, I caught sight of someone standing in the back of the room. "Eric." He wasn't trying to get my attention. He wasn't rolling his eyes or smirking like he once would have. For the first time in his life, Eric Barnes sat quietly and listened. And I no longer felt anger toward him. I no longer felt anything toward him. Because this moment? This wasn't about him. This was my moment.